Mrs. Gardner saw that Elizabeth liked Wickham very much. She gave her niece some kindly advice. "Lizzie," she said, "you must be on your guard with Wickham. I have nothing to say against him. If he had the fortune he ought to have, you couldn't do better. But as it is, please don't let your fancy run away with you. Don't disappoint your father." "At present, I am not in love with Mr. Wickham," Elizabeth answered. "But he is the most agreeable man I ever met. And if he does really become attached to me, but it would be better if he did not. Oh, that abominable Mr. Darcy. But I promise I'll try to do what I think is wisest. Are you satisfied now?" Her aunt assured her that she was. It was one of those rare and wonderful occasions in which advice wasn't resented. The Gardiners, with Jane in tow, left for London. A few days later, Mr. Collins arrived at Lucas Lodge. He and his bride-to-be were going to Kent the next day. Before leaving, Charlotte came to say goodbye to Elizabeth. "I have a favor to ask, Elizabeth," she said. "Will you come and see me?" Though she saw little pleasure in the visit, Elizabeth couldn't refuse. She agreed to come in March. Sir William would be coming then, along with his second oldest daughter, Maria. Meanwhile, Elizabeth waited impatiently for Jane's letters from London. But Jane's news was sad indeed. After a month, she'd seen nothing of Bingley. She'd paid one visit to Caroline, but the visit was not returned for weeks. When Caroline did come at last, she was not polite. Jane wrote, "I am afraid you are quite correct, dearest Lizzie. It seems that Caroline has never liked me. I pity her, but I'm sure that she's concerned for her brother. We know that he never really cared for me, but perhaps she feels differently. Yet I wonder, if he had cared for me, he would have visited me long ago. He knows I'm in town, I am sure. Yet I cannot understand it. I'm almost tempted to think I have been deceived." This letter pained Elizabeth. She could no longer wish that Bingley would see Jane again. Indeed, the more she thought about it, the worse his behavior seemed. January and February passed. Then March arrived, and Elizabeth left to visit Charlotte. On the way to Kent, she stopped in London to see Jane and the Gardiners. As soon as she could, Elizabeth asked her and how Jane was feeling. She was saddened, but not surprised, to hear that Jane was often depressed. Then Mrs. Gardner asked about Wickham. Elizabeth told her that he now seemed interested in someone else. The young woman's name was Miss King. Her greatest charm was having recently inherited £10,000. Elizabeth found no fault in his wish to be independent. Wickham had touched her heart only lightly. She believed that she would have been his first choice, if money had been no object. Before they left, Mr. and Mrs. Gardner invited Elizabeth to take a tour with them in the summer. Nothing could be more agreeable to Elizabeth. "My dear, dear aunt," she cried. "What delight! Goodbye to disappointment. What are men compared to rocks and mountains?" She left for Kent in good spirits. Charlotte welcomed her with great pleasure. Mr. Collins was in his glory, pointing out every detail of the fine house. She wondered how her friend could look so content. Most of the time, Charlotte wisely didn't seem to hear him. 2 days later they were invited to dine at Rosings, the estate of Lady Catherine. Mr. Collins' triumph was complete. As they entered the house, he pointed out every magnificent detail. Sir William was awed. Maria seemed frightened out of her wits. Elizabeth was calm and curious. Lady Catherine was a tall, big-boned woman with strong features. She spoke with natural authority. Her daughter, Miss de Bourges, was very small and sickly-looking. Thinking of Darcy, Elizabeth said to herself, "Oh, yes, she'll make him a proper wife." Dinner was grand indeed. All the servants and all the silverware that Mr. Collins had promised were there. He complimented Lady Catherine excessively, and Sir William echoed him. Lady Catherine was pleased with the praise. She advised Charlotte about managing her house, her cows, and her poultry. Then she turned to Elizabeth. She asked her about her family, her sisters, and what sort of carriage her father had. Elizabeth felt the impertinence of all these questions. But she answered her politely. At length, Lady Catherine asked, "Have any of your younger sisters come out?" "Yes, ma'am, all of them," Elizabeth said. "All?" Lady Catherine exclaimed. "And the younger ones are out before the elder ones are married? How very odd." "If the elder sisters do not marry early," Elizabeth answered, "it would be very hard on the younger ones. Surely, the last born have as much right to enter society as the first." "Upon my word. Lady Catherine cried. You give your opinion very freely for such a young person. What is your age? With 3 sisters grown up, Elizabeth said with a smile, Your ladyship can hardly expect me to tell my age. Lady Catherine seemed very surprised at not receiving a direct answer. You cannot be more than 20, I am sure, she said. I am not 21, Elizabeth said. After a very dull game of cards, Elizabeth was greatly relieved when the evening was finally over.